Welcome to Module 1 of ED 621 Backwards Design, Curriculum Development. We're going to go over what's in Module 1 and then we'll get started with talking about unpacking standards. So, first you have in Module 1, checking for understanding. You can do that before or after. It's just to give you an idea of how you're tracking the information that's going through this unit. Creating measurable objectives will be, you'll watch that after you watch this. In this screencast, after the overview, I'll talk to you about unpacking your standards. We have a graphic that shows Bloom's taxonomy, measurable verbs. And what's important to notice about this is that it's scaffolded from very simple recall information all the way to evaluation. This is the old version of Bloom's, but it's the scaffolding part. And what you as a teacher and a curriculum developer are wanting to do is to move this questioning and student thinking from the really basic through up into the area of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, because you're asking students to investigate. You're not just asking them to recall information. You want them to apply information, of course. You know, that's just the big world application, is can they do it in other contexts besides the classroom. There's my little arrow. There's also a taxonomy, a couple graphics for Bloom's digital tasks that gives you an idea of what language you can use when setting up your goals and objectives using technology for technology. And of course your flip quick questions, which are the Krathwohl and Anderson revision of Bloom's. So those active verbs are very important throughout your whole lesson planning and your whole unit planning. So right now we're beginning a lesson, but you're also keeping in mind your unit. The Bloom's taxonomy tree is just a fun little graphic that shows, this is based on the Krathwohl and Anderson's, but you can see that you have for understanding, these are the kind of verbs that you can ask students to use, or that you can use in writing and ask students to use. Applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. So you can see all these wonderful verbs that are fun and useful for your goal and objective designing pleasure. We have just the slides for standards to goals and measurable objectives. This is for the whole ABC. I probably should have put this out in the front. Maybe I will also do that. This template is going to be used throughout this whole A, and then it expands to be a unit template. So because it's a Word document, you can expand it any way you want, but it still has the same elements. But for a lesson, we're keeping it small, and for a unit, we're expanding that. So just know that that's the template you'll be writing on and submitting for your assignments. And then for every module, I will have an example of what your assignment might look like. It's taken from the UBD workbook they have with Wiggins and McTighe. So if you want to get that on your own, it's the Understanding by Design workbook, and that's not required. I'm going to be including information from it and graphic organizers from it. But if you ever decide that you want a little more support in terms of what we're doing with Understanding by Design, that would be a book to get. But anyway, so this will have assignment. Well, I'll show it to you. You can see that the pieces that you're going to put in are in red, and this is what at the end of Module 1 I will see from you. You probably will have more than one goal. You'll choose your content standard, and then you'll have your objectives, which our students want to know and students will be able to do. What will students be able to do? So that's just the example. So remember that your content standards are over here to select, and that any texts you need will be I didn't actually have this. Here we go. Module 1. I went over this in the overview, but this is really where we are, what your objectives are. So now I'm going to open up the PowerPoint and go over unpacking standards and goals with you. So here we go. Unpacking standards and creating transfer goals, designing measurable objectives for a single content area lesson plan. So this first part is just going to be creating the transfer goals. What are transfer goals, you ask? Well, let's go back a little bit first. What is backwards design? Why is backwards design important? Because if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there? So the idea of backwards design and curriculum development is that you actually start from the end and work your way backwards to how you're going to get to the end. So you're at the top of the ladder and you're backing down to the bottom of the ladder. So the bottom of the ladder is going to be the foundation for how they show you what they've learned at the end. There are 3 stages of backwards design. The stage 1 is desired goal, which comes from the standards. So you always start planning with the end goal in mind. So this is just a mindset. We're calling it backwards design. We're calling it UBD because Wiggins and Matai gave it a framework. But it's really what good lesson planning and good teachers do. Develop essential questions and understandings that students will address during the unit, and we call them enduring understandings. Students will be assessed on these understandings. Stage 2 is assessment evidence, and assessment is directly related to where you want them to go. How can I tell when my students have achieved the goal? Using a test, a project, other. These may need to be differentiated to fit student needs. So really, assessment is where you start differentiating. And then stage 3, the learning plan. How will my students get to that goal? What can I do to equip my students to reach the goal, and how long will it take? And that's where you get into the nitty-gritty of the daily work. It also would be differentiated. And you can see these descriptions came from Tomlinson and Matai's book, Integrating Instruction and Understanding by Design. So we want to unpack standards. That's where we're going to start today. And always we're asking ourselves, what is worth teaching and assessing? Now your standards, by default, are telling you what's worth teaching and assessing. The state has designed standards. Your school district may have design standards. But they've already determined what is worth teaching and assessing. So really that question narrows down to how are you going to do that makes it worth teaching and assessing. There are 4 categories of unpacking standards, and we're going to look at the long-term transfer goals in this particular module. Then there are overarching understandings and essential questions, which we'll look at in Module 2, and a set of recurring cornerstone tasks, which are really benchmarks and can be addressed in assessments. I don't know how much we're really going to spend time on cornerstone tasks. The first step in translating core standards into engaging and outcome-focused curriculum involves a careful reading of the documents in order to ensure clarity about the end results and an understanding how the pieces fit together. That's education talk for what are your standards? Where are you going? Right? So the standards, we need to translate them and decide what they mean. So transfer goals identify the effective uses of content understanding and knowledge and skill that we seek in the long run. What we want students to be able to know and do when they confront new challenges both in and outside of school. And that's really the key, both in and outside of school. Transfer goals are those goals that you want them to be able to access, or the information, the knowledge, and the skills you want them to have when you're done with your academics, with the school year, with the unit. But the important part about transfer goals is not so much that they can do it in a quarter or a semester or a year, but that they can go out with their family, and that information will become useful to them in a life situation, which is outside of the narrow scope of school. And you will hear that again and again. Okay, just did a little cut there. So, one of the things we have to be very careful about in terms of the language that we use in writing goals and objectives is including verbs of thinking that is very difficult or impossible to measure or explain. So we're talking about data-driven instruction, we're talking about data-driven assessments. So these verbs don't work. Know, understand, appreciate, think about, learned. What does it mean to know? What does it look like to understand? You will always be asked to rewrite if you use know or understand, as an example, as a thinking verb in goals, objectives, and assessments, because there's no way to measure that in a specific way. They're vague. There are many ways to know and understand. Which way do you mean? What does it look like? What does it mean to appreciate? What does it mean to recognize? There are lots of ways to recognize something. For example, identify value. So, what do you mean? What do you want? Where do you want to go with it? And use that verb. So your Bloom's Taxonomy Quick Flip book is a very useful book. Your little bird chart is a useful chart. The digital Bloom's is very useful. The folder in the Getting Started has much more information on Bloom's. You know, I remember as a teacher getting tired of Bloom's, but the reality of it is it's a great resource for a lot of vocabulary, and as a teacher you want to definitely not sit and rest down and remembering and understanding, but you want your kids up there evaluating and creating. There are times when remembering and understanding is all you want, and that's fine, but for acceptable evidence, it will vary depending, but will always have some kind of active verb that describes the action you desire. Let's unpack a standard. So when we unpack a standard, we make sure that all the verbs are defined and can be measured. So you can't measure appreciate or understand. It can easily be understood by students and families. The learning is relevant, and we're talking again about the internal consistency, the internal relevancy to the content area you're teaching, as well as relevant to the world at large, and even the world, the immediate society at large, or the world at large. The learning is something the child should be able to know or do, and is important beyond the student's immediate interests or cultures, and global. And the point of this statement is not to diminish a culture. You have Tlingit students, and you want to relate all of this to Tlingit culture. That's not the issue. The issue is a global ability to understand and do something that will apply to Tlingit culture, U.S. culture, and their framework for understanding other cultures. So they're global skills. They're not specific to a culture or a child's interest. What is worth teaching and assessing? How are they going to get along in society? So here is a Citizenship Content Standard along with some performance indicators. A student should have the knowledge and skills necessary to participate effectively as an informed and responsible citizen. That's the overall standard. It's very broad and absolutely can be measured by umpteen types of skills and knowledge that a person would carry with them. So because they feel that these are important in this particular grade level, they want students to know the important characteristics of citizenship, and that it is important for citizens to fulfill their public responsibilities. So those are like they could even be enduring understandings. We'll talk about that in the next module. So here are some performance indicators. Now the performance indicators are more specific in the sense that they have active verbs. Be able to exercise political participation by discussing public issues, building consensus, becoming involved in political parties and political campaigns, and voting. Is that complicated? The answer is yes, it is. Is that a goal? No, it's not. But these are where you can start extracting the goals. Or be able to establish, explain, and apply criteria useful in evaluating rules and laws. Whew, that's a lot of information. Again, that's just a substandard. It's a standard below the overarching standard. But these are still very broad, very generalizable, very abstract. So all of these, although they have now they've added some active verbs, are still very complex and are beyond the scope of instruction as you have the time in the course of a year to provide it. So, noticing the thinking and doing verbs are highlighted in red, and from those verbs you'll create your objectives. So right now we're going to create goals, and those transfer goals also need to be family friendly with clear action verbs, and then can be used to write your objectives when you do that next. So here's the standard. A student should have the knowledge and skills necessary to participate effectively as an informed and responsible citizen. And now we have some transfer goals. A student can explain the important characteristics of citizenship. These aren't objectives. Objectives are much more specific. A student, but they are measurable. All the same, you can see down the road to ways to measure the goals. So the idea is that they will be able to be measured, and they're not complex. We've taken them out of their performance indicators in the standard, and we're getting more specific. A student can explain the value of community service. A student can apply criteria to evaluate rules and laws, discuss issues in order to build consensus, apply strategies to solve problems and resolve conflict, research a candidate to inform their voting choices. So we've got somewhere to go. Now we know where we want to go. At the end of the lesson, they should be able to do this, and you will have evidence to show that they can actually have done it. So make it simple. Make it simple. You'll hear and see that throughout the course, throughout this curriculum development course. Make it simple. The transfer goals are still broad, but can be much more easily transformed into measurable objectives due to the use of active verbs. Also notice that they are narrowed down specific to an area of endeavor, and that the multiple tasks seen in the performance indicators are separated out, so the objectives are not as complex, or the objective is not as complex. This will eventually help you to effectively scaffold the learning experiences. So it's all connected. It's that big ladder I was talking about. The point of this task is to turn established standards into transfer goals that are easily understood by students, easily understood by families, measurable, and ready to be aligned and transformed into measurable objectives. So, next steps. After you've selected your content standard and created a transfer goal for it, view Designing Measurable Objectives PowerPoint and design the objectives for your goals. Please do not submit your work until you have completed the measurable objectives. These are all due this week. It's, I think, probably the hardest brain part of the task will be working out those objectives, or yeah, the goals rather. The objectives, it'll be quite more. Once you get your goals down, the objectives will just kind of come out. So let me know if you have any questions, and enjoy the next screenshot as you work on your first section of your small lesson plan.